Silk mist climbs the valley walls like slow breath, wrapping itself around cedar trunks that have stood for centuries, their bark dark with rain and age. Dawn comes reluctantly to these mountains, the light seeping rather than breaking, turning fog to pearl and shadow to gentle gray. A young man sits motionless on worn floorboards that smell of hinoki wood and old incense. His legs are folded beneath him in perfect stillness, though he has been here since the hour of the tiger, since the darkness was absolute and complete. Paper lanterns cast their warm, trembling light across his face, catching the edge of his cheekbone, the calm set of his mouth. His hand rests on the scabbard beside him, lacquered black and smooth as river stone, and inside that darkness of wood and lacquer waits the blade, the soul of steel that he has never used to take a life but carries always, the weight of it familiar as his own bones. Somewhere distant, perhaps beyond 3 valleys or only one, a bronze bell hums its morning prayer, the sound arriving not all at once, but in waves, each ring contained within the one before. Ripples in water, ripples in air, ripples in time itself. He is samurai, a word that tastes of salt and iron, a word that means to serve but will come to mean so much more, to contain within its 2 syllables an entire universe of meaning, honor and death, beauty and violence, the cherry blossom and the fallen blade. We're going to walk those paths tonight, you and I, through mist and memory, through the long corridors of history where every footfall echoes and nothing is quite as it seems. We will kneel in meditation halls where the smoke of incense still seems to drift, though the halls themselves are dust. We will stand on battlefields where the grass grows green over bones. His breath moves in rhythm with something deeper than thought, the pulse of blood, the ancient drums of the body, the tides that move through all living things whether they know it or not. His world is one that will last for centuries and then vanish like morning dew, leaving behind only stories, only the ghost prints of vanished feet on paths no longer walked. Let the day you have lived fall away like a heavy rope. We will witness the rise of warriors and the fall of dynasties, the forging of swords and the writing of poems, the moment when a civilization looks at itself and asks what it means to live with honor in a world that promises nothing but change and death and the eventual forgetting of all things. In the beginning, there was the emperor, descended according to sacred story from Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, who hid herself in a cave and plunged the world into darkness until the other gods lured her out with laughter and mirrors. The emperor sat in his palace in Kyoto, a city built according to principles learned from China, laid out in careful grids, every street and building positioned to harmonize with heaven and earth. The tensions knotted in your shoulders, the worries that circle like crows, the endless list of things undone and things still to do, all of this can wait beyond the circle of this firelight, this moment, this story that begins so long ago that the very shape of the world was different, when Japan was young and the way of the warrior had not yet been given a name. The Heian period, named for the old name of Kyoto itself, was an age of aesthetic perfection. Courtiers composed poetry by moonlight, writing on paper infused with flower petals. The very ink mixed with care to achieve exactly the right shade of black or gray or faded purple. They judged each other by the elegance of their calligraphy, the depth of their literary allusions, the way incense clung to their robes when they passed. Women wrote novels of extraordinary psychological complexity, observing the tiny movements of the human heart. The way a sleeve withdrawn too quickly could speak volumes about feeling concealed. The imperial court was a place of extraordinary refinement, where nobles dressed in layer upon layer of silk robes, each layer a specific color chosen according to season and rank. The combinations so complex that to understand them was to demonstrate one's breeding and education. But the provinces were far from the capital, beyond the mountains where the court's elegant customs seemed irrelevant and strange. Out there in the countryside, where rivers flooded and bandits roamed and disputes over land could turn violent, the great families who owned estates needed protection. Everything was symbol and suggestion, nothing stated plainly, and in this hothouse atmosphere of refinement, the actual messy business of governing provinces and maintaining order became almost vulgar, something best not discussed in polite company. These men came from provincial families, neither noble nor peasant, but somewhere in between, a class of fighters who trained from childhood in skills the court considered beneath notice. They learned to ride before they could write, spent more time with sword and spear than with brush and ink. They were called samurai, from saburao, a verb meaning to serve, to attend upon, to wait beside. They needed men who knew horses, men who could draw a bow and loose an arrow while galloping at full speed, men who would stand between their lord's household and the chaos that always threatens to break in. They were attendants, servants, guards. Nothing more. Not yet. Two families in particular rose this way, climbing from imperial descent that had fallen into obscurity, building their strength on the loyalty of armed men. The Taira and the Minamoto, their names would become synonymous with an entire age, their rivalry a story told for centuries. But watch how power shifts over generations, how the servant who seems invisible to his master is learning, observing, understanding the mechanisms of authority. The grandson of a guard becomes a captain. The great-grandson finds himself dining with nobles, his advice sought, his presence necessary. The sword, which was merely a tool, becomes a symbol that men bow to. The early samurai lived in compounds surrounded by earthen ramparts and wooden palisades, always ready to mount and ride. Their primary weapon was the bow, the great asymmetrical longbow that would become one of the distinctive features of Japanese warfare. In the Heian court, they were useful, called upon when force was needed, when elegant words and subtle hints could not resolve a problem. They put down rebellions in distant provinces. They fought each other on behalf of court factions, and with each campaign their power grew, roots spreading deep into soil the court did not even see. The armor they wore was both beautiful and practical, small iron or leather scales laced together with silk cord and colors that announced their clan and identity. The yoroi was designed for a mounted archer, protecting the left side from which arrows would come while leaving the right free to draw and release. To draw one required immense strength, and accuracy on horseback required training that began in childhood, boys shooting until their fingers bled and calloused, until the motion was inscribed into muscle and nerve, until they could release an arrow at full gallop and know by the sound of the bowstring whether it would fly true. Picture their world in those days, the 10th and 11th centuries, when the Heian court still believed itself eternal and unchanging. Morning mist rises from rice paddies, and peasants are already at work, knee-deep in water, planting the seedlings in perfect rows. Beyond the fields, forest rises up the mountain slopes, cedar and pine and maple shadows deep beneath the canopy. A samurai rides out from his compound at dawn, his horse's breath visible in the cool air, checking the boundaries of his lord's estate, alert for signs of intrusion, for tracks that should not be there. He stops at a shrine, a simple structure of unpainted wood among the trees, and bows to the kami, the spirits that dwell in all things, in the rocks and the water and the ancient trees. The helmet, the kabuto, flared at the neck and often bore elaborate crests, demon horns or buffalo horns or abstract shapes that caught the light. To see a samurai in full armor was to see something magnificent and terrible, bright color and dark iron, silk and steel, a man transformed into something larger than human, something that seemed to step out of mythology into the world of mud and blood. By the 12th century, the balance between the court and the military families had shifted irrevocably. The Taira, under the leadership of Taira no Kayamori, had maneuvered themselves into dominance, marrying into the imperial family, placing their allies in positions of authority. Kayamori was a man who understood that power in the Heian court required a delicate touch, force wrapped in silk, and he played the game masterfully, adopting the refined manners of the nobility even as he kept his warrior base intact. He is not separate from this landscape, but part of it. His life bound up with the seasons and the land, the rice that will be harvested and become his stipend, the forests that provide timber, the rivers that must be forded and sometimes fought beside. But the Minamoto had not forgotten their earlier defeat at Taira hands. In the eastern provinces, far from the capital's oversight, they were rebuilding, quietly gathering strength. Minamoto no Yoritamo, who had survived the purge of his family as a boy through a combination of luck and mercy from his enemies, was now a man grown, and he remembered everything. Winter comes to the eastern provinces with a vengeance unknown in the gentler climate of Kyoto. Snow buries the paths, transforms the landscape into something clean and brutal. In a compound where the snow is trampled black by many feet and the smoke from cooking fires rises into gray sky, preparations are being made. Men sharpen swords, check armor, see to their horses. For a time, it seemed the Taira would succeed in transforming themselves into a new aristocracy, both cultured and martial, acceptable to the court yet backed by swords. He remembered the night his father died, the smell of smoke from burning compounds, the sound of his brothers crying out in the darkness. Memory is a kind of hunger, and revenge feeds it. The Jinpei War, named for the alternative readings of the characters from Minamoto and Taira, would last 5 years and transform Japan forever. It was not fought as wars are fought now, with massed armies and coordinated strategy across vast fronts. Instead, it was a series of encounters, ambushes, sieges, raids, some involving thousands of warriors, others merely handfuls of men fighting over a bridge or a mountain pass. The warriors of this era fought according to customs that seem strange to modern eyes. The air smells of charcoal and iron and the sweat of nervous animals who sense their riders' tension. Yoritamo moves among them, and though he is not the warrior his younger brother Yoshitsune will prove to be, he has something perhaps more valuable, the ability to inspire loyalty, to make men believe that their cause is just and their victory foreordained by heaven. At the Battle of Kurakara Pass in the mountains of northern Honshu, the Minamoto commander Yashinaka faced a larger Taira force and knew he could not win through straightforward confrontation. Instead, he waited for darkness, and then he had his men gather cattle and tie torches to their horns. Before battle, champions would ride forward from each army and call out their names and lineage, reciting their accomplishments, challenging worthy opponents to face them in single combat while the armies watched. It was war as theater as ritual, violence constrained and channeled by elaborate rules that everyone understood. The war swung back and forth, victories and defeats balanced on the edge of chance and weather and individual courage or cowardice. The Terra controlled the capital and held the sacred symbols of imperial authority, the jewel and the mirror, two of the three imperial regalia. The cattle, maddened by the fire and the noise, stampeded toward the Terra position, and the Terra, seeing 1,000 lights advancing through the darkness and hearing the thunder of hooves, believed they faced a massive assault. They broke and fled, and many tumbled over cliffs in the darkness, falling into ravines where their bodies were found days later, broken among the rocks. The final confrontation came at Danoyura, where the inland sea narrows between the main island of Honshu and the southern island of Kyushu. The Terra, driven back step by step across the country, assembled their remaining strength in a fleet of boats. They carried with them the child emperor Antoku, barely 7 years old, whose grandmother was determined that he would not fall into enemy hands. But the Minamoto had the hunger of the dispossessed, and they had Yoshitsune, who fought like something out of legend, appearing where he was not expected, striking and vanishing like a ghost. A warrior so brilliant that centuries later people would argue whether he was a genius or something more, touched by the gods or the spirits of ancient heroes. The Minamoto fleet approaches, and Yoshitsune is in command, and he has noticed something the Terra have overlooked. The Terra warriors, trained to fight on horseback on solid ground, are uncomfortable on the shifting decks of boats. Their strength is compromised by uncertainty. Imagine the scene on that April morning in 1185, hundreds of boats crowded together, the water gray and choppy, clouds racing overhead. The Terra warriors stand in their armor, the lacquered scales reflecting dull light, their faces grim. They know this is the end. Some have already decided how they will die. The Terra boats lose their coordination, drifting, colliding with each other. Minamoto forces board them, and the fighting becomes brutal and close, swords and naginata swinging in the confined space, men slipping on decks wet with blood and spray. The current shifts as the tide changes, and now it favors the Minamoto, carrying their boats forward while pushing the Terra back. Everything is coming undone. Terra warriors begin to throw themselves into the sea rather than face capture, the weight of their armor dragging them down into the dark water. The emperor's grandmother, a woman named Nino Ama who has lived through decades of court intrigue and civil war, dresses the child emperor Antoku in his finest robes. Yoshitsune orders his archers to ignore the warriors and target the helmsmen and rowers, the men who control the boats themselves. It is considered dishonorable, attacking non-combatants, but Yoshitsune understands that honor is a luxury of the victorious, and he is not here to be honorable, he is here to win. She tells him that beneath the waves there is a capital more beautiful than any on land. She takes him in her arms and walks into the sea. With the Terra destroyed, Yoritamo faced the question that faces all victors. What now? He could have taken his place at court, become another noble family competing for influence in the endless intrigue of Kyoto. Instead, he did something unprecedented. He remained in the east, in Kamakura, a town on the coast surrounded by hills, defensible and far from the capital's corruption. The sacred sword, one of the three imperial regalia, sinks with them. It will never be recovered. Some say it was a replica, that the real sword had been hidden away long before, but others believe the true sword lies still in the mud at the bottom of the strait, waiting in the darkness for a time that will never come. In 1192, Yoritomo accepted the title of shogun, barbarian subduing generalissimo, an ancient title that had lapsed into disuse, but which he now made the foundation of his authority. From there, he created a new form of government, the bakufu, a term that originally meant the field headquarters of a general, but came to mean something more, a parallel government that would gradually eclipse the court entirely. This was the beginning of samurai rule. It would last, in one form or another, for nearly 7 centuries. The relationship between lord and vassal, which had been one element among many in the old system, now became the organizing principle of political life. The emperor remained in Kyoto, performing rituals and conferring legitimacy by his existence. But real power, the ability to make decisions and enforce them, had moved to Kamakura, to the warrior class, to men who measured authority by the loyalty of armed followers rather than by lineage and ceremony. The ideal of loyalty would grow over the centuries into something almost religious in its intensity. A samurai was expected to be ready to die at any moment for his lord's sake, not grudgingly but eagerly, as the ultimate fulfillment of his purpose. Death in service was not tragedy, but completion, the moment when the warrior's life achieved its meaning. A samurai gave absolute loyalty to his lord, and in return received protection and support, usually in the form of land rights, the revenue from rice paddies worked by peasants. This was not a contract that could be broken lightly. To betray one's lord was the worst imaginable crime, worse than murder, worse than cowardice, a violation of the fundamental order of things. The code that would eventually be called Bushido, the way of the warrior, was not invented all at once. It emerged gradually during the Kamakura period and the centuries that followed, synthesizing elements from various traditions. From Shinto came the emphasis on purity and the sacredness of Japan itself. From Buddhism, particularly the Zen school that was being introduced from China, came meditation practices and the concept of non-attachment, the letting go of the ego and the fear of death. From Confucianism came the emphasis on hierarchy, loyalty, and filial piety. A samurai's day in the Kamakura period followed rhythms that had been established over generations. He rose before dawn, in the hour when the world is still dark, but the birds are beginning to sense the coming light. He purified himself with cold water, the shock of it driving away sleep and clearing the mind. This acceptance of mortality, this willingness to embrace death, would become central to samurai identity, shaping everything from military tactics to aesthetic preferences. All of these blended together into something distinctly Japanese, a warrior ethic that valued courage and loyalty above all, but also demanded that the samurai be cultured, educated, capable of appreciating poetry and beauty. The morning was devoted to training. Even samurai, who were primarily administrators, who spent most of their time managing estates or adjudicating disputes, maintained their martial skills. To let them atrophy was shameful, a betrayal of one's identity. The practice of swordsmanship was not just about technique, but about cultivating the proper state of mind. A swordsman who thought too much, who hesitated or calculated, would be defeated by one who had trained so thoroughly that his response was instantaneous and unthinking. He sat in meditation or prayer, depending on his particular practice, stilling the endless chatter of thought, becoming present in the moment. Breakfast was simple, rice and miso soup, perhaps some pickled vegetables, eaten without conversation, the food itself a kind of meditation. The bow also required constant practice, and archery was considered a spiritual discipline as much as a martial skill. The archers sought to achieve a state where the release of the arrow was inevitable, where there was no moment of decision, only the smooth flow from intention to action. This state of Mu Shin, no mind, was the goal of training, the point where the distinction between the swordsman and the sword disappeared, where action arose spontaneously from the situation itself without the interference of ego or fear. If the samurai held land, he had administrative duties that could not be neglected. He rode out to inspect the rice paddies, ensuring that the irrigation channels were maintained, that the peasants were working diligently, that the boundaries between his land and his neighbors were respected. Years of practice went into achieving the strength to draw the great war bows, which required pulls of over 100 pounds, and the technique to do so accurately while mounted on a galloping horse. In the evening, after training and administration, he might turn to cultural pursuits. He practiced calligraphy, the brush moving across the paper in strokes that should appear effortless but required years to master. Each character a small work of art, the balance of black ink and white paper a meditation on presence and absence. He settled disputes, dispensing a rough justice that was more concerned with maintaining order than with abstract principles of fairness. He collected taxes, usually in the form of rice, storing it in warehouses against lean years and war. He composed poetry, often in Chinese, demonstrating his education and his sensitivity to beauty. He might practice the flute, the shakuhachi, its breathy tones evoking wind in bamboo groves, the loneliness of mountain temples, the transience of all things. This balance between the martial and the cultural was not seen as contradictory. The ideal samurai was both fierce in battle and refined in peace, capable of terrible violence and exquisite aesthetic judgment. The sword and the chrysanthemum, as one later observer would put it, two faces of the same culture, two expressions of the same fundamental values. The Mongol army that landed on the beaches of Kyushu was unlike anything the Japanese had encountered. The Mongols had conquered China, Korea, Central Asia, Persia, Russia, Hungary. They were the most formidable military force on Earth, combining the mobility and archery of steppe nomads with Chinese siege, engineering, and gunpowder weapons. The Kamakura period would test the samurai in ways that no one anticipated. In 1274, word came from the continent that Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known, was demanding that Japan submit to Mongol overlordship. The shogunate refused, and Kublai responded by sending a fleet to invade. The samurai who rode out to meet them fought according to the customs they knew. Champions rode forward, announced their names and lineage, and challenged enemy warriors to individual combat. The Mongols responded by shooting them down with volleys of arrows or surrounding them and killing them with spears and swords. The first encounters were slaughters. They fought as coordinated units, moving in response to signals from flags and drums, executing complex maneuvers with precision. They had explosives, primitive bombs that made a noise like thunder and created fire and smoke, terrifying to men and horses who had never seen such things. The Mongols established a beachhead and were preparing to advance when night fell. That night, a storm rose from the sea. The wind increased to a gale, and the waves grew tall and violent. The Mongol fleet, anchored close to shore to supply the army, was caught in the storm. Ships dragged their anchors and were driven onto rocks. The samurai, brave and skilled as individuals, could not coordinate their actions effectively against an enemy that fought as a disciplined mass. The Japanese called the storm kamikaze, divine wind, and took it as a sign that the gods favored them, that Japan was sacred and protected. But the military leadership understood they had been lucky, and they used the 7 years before the second invasion to prepare. They built stone walls along the coast, fortifications designed to prevent the Mongols from landing easily. Others collided in the darkness, timbers splintering, men screaming as they were thrown into the cold water. By morning, perhaps a third of the fleet was destroyed, and the Mongol commanders decided to withdraw to Korea and try again when conditions were more favorable. The second Mongol invasion in 1281 was on an even larger scale. The fleet that approached Japan was immense, perhaps 4,400 ships carrying 140,000 soldiers. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history before the modern era, dwarfing anything Europe would attempt for centuries. The Mongols approached the coast and found the stone walls, and they could not land easily. They stockpiled weapons and supplies. They organized the samurai of Kyushu into larger units and trained them to fight in coordinated formations, setting aside the old emphasis on individual glory. The Mongols made little progress, and their army, crowded on its ships, began to suffer from disease and low morale. And then, in mid-August, another typhoon struck. For 2 days, the storm raged with apocalyptic fury. Ships were driven onto rocks, capsized by towering waves, smashed against each other in the chaos. For weeks they attacked, trying to break through the defenses, while the Japanese resisted fiercely. Samurai used small boats to conduct night raids on the Mongol fleet, boarding ships under cover of darkness, fighting on the cramped decks, and setting fires before retreating. Never again would anyone attempt to invade Japan until the 20th century. The dual typhoon secured Japan's independence and elevated the samurai to the status of national saviors, the defenders who had stood firm when the greatest empire on earth had come to conquer. But the victory created problems. The samurai expected rewards for their service, land and titles and wealth. When the storm passed and the Japanese ventured out to see what remained, they found the coast littered with wreckage for miles, bodies washing up on the beaches, survivors stumbling through the shallows in a daze. The Mongol fleet was destroyed. The invasion was over. In a normal war, the victor distributed the lands of the defeated, but the Mongols had been driven back into the sea, leaving nothing to distribute. Many samurai had exhausted their resources preparing for and fighting the invasions, and they received little in return. Resentment grew. The Kamakura shogunate, which had seemed unshakable, began to fracture under the weight of these tensions. The administration became corrupt and inefficient. Justice was administered capriciously, favoring those with connections. By the early 14th century, the system was breaking down, and into this weakness stepped Emperor Go-Daigo, who dreamed of restoring direct imperial rule. Kusunoki was not from a prominent family. He was a minor landowner who happened to be brilliant at guerrilla warfare. He used terrain to his advantage, holding fortresses in mountains where larger armies could not bring their numbers to bear. He conducted ambushes and raids, appearing where he was not expected and vanishing before his enemies could respond. Go-Daigo was not content to be a symbolic figurehead performing rituals while others governed. He actively plotted against the shogunate, gathering supporters and preparing for rebellion. In 1331, his plot was discovered, and he was exiled to a remote island, But his supporters continued to resist, and one of them, Kusunoki Masashige, would become legendary for his loyalty and tactical brilliance. The civil war that followed Go-Daigo's attempted coup lasted years and involved shifting alliances and betrayals. One of the shogunate's most powerful generals, Ashika Takauji, was sent to suppress the rebellion. But as he campaigned and observed the shogunate's weakness, he made a calculation. He switched sides, bringing his army over to the emperor's cause. For 3 years, Go-Daigo attempted to rule directly, but he was a better dreamer than administrator. He rewarded his favorites and punished his enemies according to personal preference rather than strategic logic. Takauji, who commanded the largest army, found himself sidelined in favor of courtiers with no military force. It could not last. He was a master of psychological warfare, using deception and misinformation to keep his enemies off balance. And most of all, he was absolutely loyal to the emperor, even when the cause seemed hopeless, even when common sense suggested he should abandon a lost cause and make his peace with the victors. With Takauji's support, Go-Daigo returned from exile in 1333, and the Kamakura shogunate fell. For 56 years, Japan had 2 emperors, 2 courts, each claiming to be the true heir of the sun goddess, each denouncing the other as illegitimate. This period, called the Nambokucho era, was a time of almost constant warfare. Samurai armies marched back and forth across the country, fighting battles that often accomplished nothing, serving causes that shifted with each season. By 1336, Takauji had turned against the emperor, defeated the loyalist forces, and established his own shogunate. Go-Daigo fled to the mountains, setting up a rival court and claiming to be the legitimate emperor. Kusunoki Masashige fought for Go-Daigo's southern court until the very end. In 1336, he knew that his army was outnumbered and that defeat was certain, but he could not abandon his emperor. He fought his last battle at Minatagawa, and when it was clear all was lost, he and his brother retreated to a farmhouse, composed farewell poems, and committed seppuku. Loyalty became complicated in ways it had not been before. If there were 2 emperors, 2 courts, 2 shogunates, to whom did one owe allegiance? Some samurai changed sides repeatedly, following their self-interest or their best guess about which faction would ultimately prevail. Others remained steadfast to one side or the other, even when it cost them everything. The Ashikaga shogunate, established by Takauji and based in the Muromachi district of Kyoto, brought the samurai government back to the capital. This proximity to the old imperial court had profound effects on samurai culture. The warriors, living in Kyoto and associating daily with the nobility, began to adopt refined tastes and aesthetic practices. They sponsored artists and poets. His story would be told for centuries as the ultimate example of loyalty, the warrior who chose death over betrayal, who valued honor more than life. The aesthetic that emerged during the Muromachi period, and that would come to define Japanese culture in the eyes of the world, was characterized by wabi-sabi, the finding of beauty in imperfection, in transience, in the incomplete and the humble. A tea bowl that was rough and irregular was more valued than one that was perfectly symmetrical. A scroll painting done in a few bold brushstrokes was more profound than one with elaborate detail. They built gardens that were masterpieces of suggestion and restraint, arrangements of rocks and gravel that evoked landscapes of mountains and rivers using the simplest possible means. They elevated the tea ceremony from a casual gathering to a ritualized practice embodying Zen principles of presence and simplicity. This was samurai culture at its most refined, warriors who were also poets and aesthetes, men who could kill without hesitation and also compose a haiku about cherry blossoms falling in moonlight. The two aspects were not seen as contradictory. The tea room itself was tiny and spare, with a low entrance that forced even the highest lord to bow, a space where distinctions of rank were temporarily set aside, and all participants could be fully present to the moment, to the taste of the tea, the sound of water boiling, the single flower in a bamboo vase. Yet beneath this cultural flourishing, the political situation remained unstable. The Ashikaga shoguns never achieved the control that the Kamakura rulers had exercised. The country was fragmenting into semi-independent domains ruled by daimyo, who governed their territories with increasing autonomy. They built castles, maintained private armies, and conducted their own diplomacy. The awareness of death, the understanding that all things are transient, that beauty exists precisely because it does not last, this was the foundation of their aesthetic sensibility. The cherry blossom was the perfect symbol because it bloomed gloriously and then fell within days, its beauty inseparable from its brevity. In 1467, a succession dispute within the Ashikaga family exploded into open warfare. The Unin War devastated Kyoto, turning much of the capital into ash and rubble. The conflict drew in daimyo from across the country, each pursuing their own interests under the guise of supporting one Ashikaga faction or another. The war officially ended in 1477, but the fighting did not stop. The Sengoku period was chaos given form. Central authority collapsed entirely. Each province was ruled by a daimyo whose power rested solely on his ability to defend his territory and expand at his neighbor's expense. Alliances were formed one day and broken the next. The shogun's authority became theoretical, honored in form, but often ignored in practice. Japan slid into the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, a century of almost continuous conflict. The samurai of this era were different from their ancestors. Armies grew larger, incorporating thousands of ashigaru, foot soldiers recruited from the peasantry and armed with spears and bows. The introduction of firearms by Portuguese traders in 1543 transformed warfare completely. A daimyo who grew weak through age or defeat might be overthrown by his own retainers in a process called gekakujo, the lower overcoming the higher. It was a time when ancient lineages could be extinguished overnight and clever peasants could rise to become lords. The only truth was power, the only virtue survival. At first, many samurai despised firearms as dishonorable weapons that required no skill and gave no glory. But the daimyo who adopted them won battles, and the daimyo who clung to tradition died. The arquebus, a primitive matchlock musket, was inaccurate and slow to reload, but it required only weeks to train someone to use it effectively, while training a skilled archer took years. A peasant with a gun could kill a mounted samurai who had practiced swordsmanship since childhood. The castles built during the Sengoku period reflected the era's violence. Earlier fortifications had been relatively simple, but now castles grew massive and sophisticated, designed to withstand cannon fire and arquebus fire, to resist siege for months if necessary. Stone walls rose 30 feet high, their surfaces curved to deflect projectiles. Within a generation, Japanese craftsmen were producing firearms superior to the Portuguese models. and battles were dominated by lines of arquebusiers firing in volleys, while samurai cavalry waited to exploit any opening. The samurai of this period lived in a world that was brutal but also strangely liberating. With the old hierarchies broken down, talent was rewarded more than birth. A clever strategy, a bold risk, a moment of courage or treachery could elevate a warrior or destroy him. Multiple layers of moats and walls protected the central keep, creating killing zones where attackers would be exposed to fire from multiple directions. Yet even as they were fortresses, these castles were also works of art. Their white plastered walls gleaming like snow, their roofs elegantly curved and decorated with golden dolphins and other protective symbols. Life was short and uncertain, but for those who thrived on conflict, who found meaning in the test of combat, it was an age of opportunity. Oda Nobunaga was born in 1534 into a family of minor daimyo in Owari province. As a young man, he was considered strange, eccentric, prone to behavior that violated propriety. He wore outlandish clothes, associated with merchants and common people, ignored the elaborate rituals of his class. Many predicted he would fail. From this chaos would emerge three men who would reunify Japan. Their names are still known, still recited like an incantation. Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu. There's a saying about them, a verse that captures their different characters. If the cuckoo will not sing, Nobunaga will kill it. Hideyoshi will make it want to sing, and Ieyasu will wait for it to sing. Nobunaga organized his forces with ruthless efficiency. He drilled his Ashigaru foot soldiers until they could move and fight as coordinated units. He equipped them with firearms and trained them to fire in volleys, creating continuous fire that could devastate even the finest cavalry. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, facing the legendary cavalry of the Takeda clan, Nobunaga demonstrated his mastery of the new warfare. He positioned thousands of arquebusiers behind wooden palisades and waited for the Takeda cavalry to charge. Wave after wave of mounted samurai, the finest warriors in Japan, charged into the teeth of volley fire and were cut down. Nobunaga was also utterly ruthless toward those who opposed him. When the Buddhist monasteries on Mount High, which had maintained their own armies for centuries and frequently interfered in politics, stood against him, he besieged the mountain and burned every building, killing everyone he found, monks and women and children alike. Instead, he became one of the most formidable warlords Japan had ever seen, a man who understood that the future belonged to those willing to break with tradition. It was systematic slaughter, and it marked the end of an era, the moment when the mounted samurai ceased to dominate the battlefield. Yet he was also curious and pragmatic. When Jesuit missionaries arrived from Portugal, bringing with them stories of distant lands and strange customs, Nobunaga welcomed them, fascinated by their knowledge and interested in the possibilities of trade with Europe. By 1582, Nobunaga controlled much of central Japan. He had deposed the last Ashikaga shogun and ruled from a magnificent castle at Azuchi, built on a hill overlooking Lake Biwa, its interior decorated with gold leaf and painted screens, a monument to his power and ambition. He had not yet taken the title of shogun, perhaps intending something greater, but he would never get the chance. In June of that year, one of his generals, Akechi Mitsuhide, betrayed him. Nobunaga was staying at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto with only a small guard when Akechi's forces surrounded the building. Realizing there was no escape, Nobunaga retreated to an inner room, set it on fire, and committed seppuku, his attendants following him into death. His body was never recovered from the flames. He saw the militant Buddhist sects as threats to his authority and worked systematically to break their power, burning temples, massacring adherents, confiscating their lands. He allowed them to preach and build churches, not out of religious sympathy, but because he saw Christianity as a useful counterweight to Buddhism. He was 49 years old. Hideyoshi's story is extraordinary. A peasant who became the most powerful man in Japan through sheer ability. He was born the son of a foot soldier, with no samurai lineage, no connections, nothing but intelligence and determination. He entered Nobunaga's service at the lowest level, carrying his sandals, and rose through merit, becoming one of Nobunaga's most trusted generals. Akechi claimed he acted because Nobunaga had become tyrannical, but his true motives remain mysterious. What is certain is that his betrayal failed. Within days, another of Nobunaga's generals, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, had force-marched his army back from a distant campaign, defeated Akechi in battle, and claimed leadership of Nobunaga's forces. After avenging Nobunaga, Hideyoshi continued the work of unification, one by one, through force or diplomacy or a combination of both. He brought the remaining independent daimyo under his control. By 1590, he had achieved what had seemed impossible, the complete unification of Japan under a single authority. He was a skilled diplomat as well as a commander, able to win enemies over through negotiation as often as through force. He understood logistics, ensuring his armies were well supplied even on distant campaigns. He was clever and pragmatic, earning the nickname the Monkey for his quick wit and his looks, which were not handsome by conventional standards. Hideyoshi instituted reforms that would shape Japanese society for centuries. He conducted a comprehensive land survey, establishing clear ownership and tax obligations for every rice paddy in the country. He ordered the sword hunt, confiscating weapons from peasants and forbidding them to possess swords or other arms. With Japan unified and at peace, Hideyoshi's ambitions turned outward. He conceived a grandiose plan to conquer China, using Korea as a bridge. In 1592, he sent a massive invasion force to Korea, beginning a war that would last 7 years and accomplish nothing but destruction and suffering. He could not become shogun because he lacked the necessary lineage. So instead he took the title of Kampuku, imperial regent, ruling in the emperor's name. This formalized the division between samurai and commoners, making the warrior class a hereditary caste legally distinct from the rest of society. A peasant's son could no longer rise to become a samurai as Hideyoshi himself had done. The Japanese armies initially swept through Korea, but Chinese intervention and determined Korean resistance, particularly the brilliant naval campaigns of Admiral Yi Sun-sin, whose turtle ships decimated Japanese supply lines, turned the invasion into a costly stalemate. The war dragged on until Hideyoshi died in 1598, and the Japanese armies quickly withdrew. Sekigahara was the decisive battle, the largest samurai battle ever fought. Over 160,000 warriors participated, divided into two great armies. On one side were forces nominally loyal to Hideyoshi's heir, led by Ishida Mitsunari, a civil administrator who lacked the military reputation to command the loyalty of hard-bitten warriors. Hideyoshi's death left a power vacuum. He had a young son, but Japan's most powerful daimyo were not inclined to serve a child. Factions formed around different leaders, and tensions escalated until October 1600, when they exploded into battle at Sekigahara. The battle took place in a valley surrounded by mountains, fog thick in the cold autumn morning. The two armies faced each other, banners rippling in the wind, the smell of smoke from matchlocks drifting across the field. For hours they fought, a Shigeru-foot soldiers clashing with spears and swords, samurai cavalry seeking openings, arquebusiers firing volleys that rolled like thunder. On the other side stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, the most powerful of Hideyoshi's former allies, a man who had been building his power base for decades, forming alliances, making promises, waiting for his moment. In the aftermath, Ieyasu executed his enemies and redistributed their lands to his supporters. In 1603, he accepted the title of shogun, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate that would rule Japan until 1868, an unprecedented 265 years of peace. Ieyasu moved his capital to Edo, a small castle town on the Kanto Plain that would grow into Tokyo, one of the world's great cities. The system he designed was intricate and clever, a web of obligations and constraints that made rebellion nearly impossible. The daimyo were categorized based on their relationship to the Tokugawa family. Those who had supported Ieyasu before Sekigahara were favored, given strategic territories, and trusted with important positions. Those who had opposed him or remained neutral were tolerated but watched, their domains scattered and less wealthy. All daimyo were required to participate in the Sankin-Kotai system, spending alternate years in Edo attending the shogun's court. And when they returned to their provinces, they had to leave their families behind in the capital as hostages. The outcome hung in balance until, as Ieyasu had planned, several of Ishida's commanders suddenly turned on their own allies, attacking them from behind. The betrayal caused panic and collapse. Ishida's forces broke and fled, and Ieyasu's victory was complete. His goal was stability, the creation of a system that would prevent the chaos of the Sengoku period from ever recurring. Christianity, which had spread during the late 16th century, was now seen as a dangerous foreign ideology that might inspire loyalty to powers beyond Japan. The Tokugawa government issued increasingly harsh edicts restricting Christian practice, and when these were defied, persecution followed. This ensured loyalty while also bankrupting the daimyo through the enormous expense of maintaining multiple households and traveling with elaborate retinues. Japan now closed itself to the outside world almost completely. Foreign trade was restricted to a tiny Dutch trading post on Dejima, an artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor. Japanese citizens were forbidden to leave the country or to return if they did. In 1637, Christian peasants and masterless samurai in Kyushu rose in rebellion, seizing Hara Castle and holding out for months against massive shogunate forces. When the castle fell, the rebels were slaughtered and Christianity was driven completely underground, surviving only in secret, passed down through generations in whispers and hidden symbols. In this closed, stable world, the samurai faced an identity crisis. There were no wars to fight. The samurai remained a privileged class, allowed to wear two swords as symbols of their status, exempt from many taxes and obligations that burdened commoners, granted stipends by their lords. But their function, that of warriors, had become obsolete. The answer that emerged over the 17th and 18th centuries was that the samurai must become models of moral cultivation and cultural refinement. If they no longer fought, they could serve as administrators, judges, teachers, exemplars of proper conduct. This policy of sakoku, national seclusion, would last for over 2 centuries, preserving Japan's independence, but isolating it from the rapid changes transforming the rest of the world. The question became, what is a samurai in a world without war? The samurai of the Edo period studied an extraordinarily wide range of subjects. They learned swordsmanship, practicing forms and techniques in dojo that were part school and part temple. But this was swordsmanship not for battle, but for character development, for achieving mental discipline and spiritual insight. The code of Bushido, which had been a practical set of warrior values, was elaborated into a comprehensive philosophy, a complete way of life. Confucian scholars, whose influence grew significantly during the Tokugawa period, contributed to this development, emphasizing loyalty, hierarchy, self-cultivation, and duty. Samurai also studied calligraphy, the brush becoming an extension of the body, each stroke an expression of character and training. They composed poetry in Chinese and Japanese, demonstrating literary knowledge and aesthetic sensitivity. The sword schools taught that true mastery came not from physical skill, but from cultivating the correct mental state, a condition of mushin, no mind, where one reacted instantaneously without the interference of thought or emotion. The greatest swordsmen were often Zen practitioners who saw their art as a form of moving meditation. Many samurai became scholars, studying Confucian classics, history, military strategy. Some became doctors, learning herbal medicine and acupuncture. Others became engineers, designing irrigation systems and bridges. The division between the martial and the intellectual, which had always been somewhat artificial, now disappeared almost entirely. They practiced the tea ceremony, spending hours preparing and serving tea according to precise rituals that embodied principles of harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility. They studied ikebana, flower arranging, finding in the placement of a few stems and blossoms an expression of the same principles that govern their swordsmanship: simplicity, balance, presence in the moment. Yet there was always a tension, a sense of something lost. These were men raised on stories of ancestral warriors who fought on horseback and died gloriously in battle, living in a society that no longer needed warriors. Some threw themselves into their studies and cultural pursuits with the intensity their ancestors had brought to combat. The figure of the Ronin became increasingly common. Masterless samurai whose lords had died without heirs or who had been dismissed for some infraction. Without a master, they had no stipend, no place in the rigid social hierarchy. Some became teachers, opening schools where they taught swordsmanship or calligraphy or poetry. The ideal samurai was a complete person, cultivated in every dimension. Others fell into depression or dissolution, frequenting the pleasure quarters of Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, accumulating debts, living beyond their means in a desperate attempt to maintain the appearance of status, while their stipends bought less and less as rice prices fluctuated and inflation eroded their wealth. The most famous story of the Edo period concerns 47 such ronin. In 1701, a daimyo named Asano Naganori was provoked into drawing his sword in Edo Castle by Kira Yashinaka, a court official who had been insulting and humiliating him. Drawing a weapon within the shogun's castle was a grave offense, and Asano was ordered to commit seppuku. Others became bodyguards for merchants, a humiliating occupation for men raised to believe that commerce was beneath the warrior class. Still others drifted, taking odd jobs, gambling, sometimes turning to crime, dangerous and resentful men with nothing to lose. 47 of these former retainers, led by Oishi Kuranisuk, secretly swore to avenge their master by killing Kira. But they understood that Kira would be expecting such an attempt, so they spent 2 years pretending to abandon their cause. Oishi himself played the part of a dissolute drunk, frequenting brothels and gambling houses, acting as if he had given up all samurai values. Then, on a snowy night in December 1702, the 47 Ronin attacked Kira's mansion. They overpowered the guards, fought their way to Kira's rooms, and killed him. They cut off his head and carried it through the snowy streets to Sengakuji Temple, where they laid it before their master's grave. He obeyed, plunging the blade into his abdomen and dying as was expected of a samurai. His domain was confiscated, and his retainers became Ronin, masterless and without prospects. The deception worked. Kira and the authorities relaxed their vigilance. Then they turned themselves into the authorities, knowing they had violated the law, but having fulfilled their duty. The shogunate faced a dilemma. The Ronin had acted according to samurai values, avenging their master, demonstrating perfect loyalty. But they had also defied the law, committing murder and disturbing the peace. After much deliberation, the shogunate allowed them to commit seppuku rather than be executed as common criminals, dying as samurai rather than as criminals. As the Edo period progressed through the 18th and into the 19th century, Japan remained stable and prosperous, but increasingly isolated from a world that was changing rapidly. In Europe and America, the Industrial Revolution was transforming economies and societies, creating new technologies and new forms of power. The story of the 47 Ronin became a cultural phenomenon, retold in kabuki plays, in novels, and woodblock prints. It represented the tension at the heart of Tokugawa samurai identity, the conflict between loyalty to one's lord and obedience to the law, between the old ways of personal honor and the new requirements of society, based on order and hierarchy. The awakening came suddenly and traumatically. On July 8, 1853, 4 American warships sailed into Edo Bay. The black-hulled steamships, which the Japanese called Kirofune, black ships, were unlike anything Japan had seen. They moved against wind and tide, propelled by paddle wheels driven by steam engines, trailing black smoke. They mounted powerful cannons and carried modern rifles. Steam engines, railroads, factories, telegraph lines, innovations in metallurgy and chemistry. All of this was developing at breathtaking speed. The samurai, training with swords in a country where even firearms were tightly controlled and the arts of war had become almost ceremonial, had no idea how far behind they were falling. The shogunate, realizing it lacked the military capacity to resist, agreed to negotiate. In 1854, the Convention of Kanagawa was signed, opening 2 ports to American ships. Similar treaties followed with Britain, Russia, the Netherlands, and France. These treaties, called the Unequal Treaties, were humiliating. Commodore Matthew Perry commanded the expedition, and he carried a letter from the American president demanding that Japan open its ports to trade and provide assistance to American whaling vessels. The implicit threat was clear: comply or face bombardment. The shogunate, which had maintained control for over 200 years, suddenly appeared weak and incompetent, unable to protect Japan from foreign interference. Opposition crystallized around the imperial court in Kyoto, which had remained powerless but symbolically important throughout the Tokugawa period. They granted foreigners extraterritorial rights, meaning they could not be tried in Japanese courts for crimes committed in Japan. They prevented Japan from setting its own tariffs. They opened Japan to foreign influence after 2.5 centuries of seclusion. These activists were young, passionate, and often desperate. They engaged in political terrorism, assassinating shogunate officials and foreigners, attacking anyone they saw as complicit in Japan's humiliation. The country slid toward civil war. In 1867, the last Tokugawa shogun, Yoshinobu, resigned and returned authority to the emperor, hoping to retain influence in a new political arrangement. Activists, many of them lower-ranking samurai from domains in southern and western Japan, began calling for the restoration of imperial rule and the expulsion of foreigners. Their slogan was Sano Joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. The Boshin War followed, a relatively brief civil war in which the imperial forces, equipped with modern weapons purchased from the West, defeated the shogunate loyalists. The decisive battles were often one-sided, the new government forces using rifles and artillery against enemies still relying primarily on swords and spears. The leaders of the Meiji Restoration, many of them samurai who had risked everything to overthrow the shogunate, now made a radical decision to protect Japan from Western imperialism, to ensure that Japan would never be colonized as China was being carved up and India had been subjugated. Japan must modernize completely. But it didn't work out that way. In January 1868, forces from the Satsuma and Choshu domains, two of the most powerful anti-shogun Han, seized the imperial palace in Kyoto and declared the restoration of imperial rule under the young Emperor Meiji. By 1869, the war was over, and Japan faced the question of what kind of country it would become. The transformation that followed was breathtaking in its speed and scope. The feudal domains were abolished and replaced by prefectures administered by the central government. The daimyo were pensioned off and lost their powers. Most radically, the samurai class itself was abolished. In 1876, the wearing of swords in public was banned. Many samurai adapted. They used their education and discipline to become bureaucrats in the new government ministries, officers in the new Western-style army, teachers in the new school system, businessmen in the emerging modern economy. But many others could not adjust. They were trained from childhood to be warriors, to view commerce as beneath them, to measure their worth by lineage and status. It must adopt Western technology, Western governmental structures, Western military organization. Tradition must be sacrificed to survival. The stipends that had supported samurai for centuries were eliminated. Samurai were encouraged to enter business, farming, or government service, to become ordinary citizens in a new society where status was based on merit and wealth rather than birth. Some resisted with force. The most serious rebellion came in 1877 in Satsuma Domain, led by Seigo Takamori, one of the leaders of the Meiji Restoration itself. Seigo, who had helped overthrow the shogunate, now led a revolt against the government he had helped create, fighting for traditional samurai values and privileges. The Satsuma Rebellion lasted several months. Seigo's forces fought with desperate courage, charging into rifle and artillery fire with swords drawn, dying by the hundreds and thousands. But the outcome was never in doubt. Modern weapons and tactics prevailed over courage and tradition. At the final battle of Shirayama in September 1877, Seigo and his last few hundred followers, surrounded and facing overwhelming firepower, made a final charge. Seigo, wounded by a bullet, committed seppuku, assisted by a loyal retainer who severed his head. His death marked the end of the samurai as a political and military force. The New World had no place for them, and they were ruined, reduced to poverty, stripped of the identity that had defined their families for centuries. His army consisted of former samurai armed with swords and a mix of modern and traditional weapons, facing a conscript army of peasant soldiers trained in Western tactics and equipped with rifles, artillery, and Gatling guns. Yet even as the samurai class died, the samurai ideal persisted. The Meiji government promoted Bushido values as national values, applicable to all Japanese citizens. The new conscript army was taught to emulate samurai loyalty, courage, and self-sacrifice. School children learned stories of famous samurai and their deeds. This process intensified as Japan continued its transformation. The country industrialized with astonishing speed, building railroads and telegraph lines, establishing textile mills and steel foundries, creating a modern industrial economy. It built a powerful military, its army trained by German advisors and its navy by British, equipped with modern weapons manufactured in Japanese arsenals. The class that had ruled Japan for 7 centuries had been swept away in less than a decade. The samurai became a cultural touchstone, an idealized past that informed the present, a source of identity in a rapidly changing world. The darker side of this glorification of samurai values became apparent in the 20th century. The absolute loyalty and acceptance of death that were virtues in a feudal context became, when applied to modern industrial warfare, the basis for fanaticism. Japanese soldiers in World War II were taught that surrender was the ultimate disgrace, that death in battle was the highest honor, that loyalty to the emperor transcended all other considerations, including basic humanity. In 1895, Japan defeated China in a war over influence in Korea, shocking the world. In 1905, it defeated Russia, destroying the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima and becoming the first non-Western power to win a war against a European nation. Japan had joined the ranks of imperial powers. After Japan's catastrophic defeat in 1945, there was a period when the samurai legacy was questioned, seen as part of the militaristic culture that had led to disaster. The Allied occupation encouraged democracy and pacifism, and many Japanese embraced these values, seeing them as the path to a better future. The atrocities committed during the war, the treatment of prisoners, the treatment of civilians in occupied territories, had many causes, but among them was this distorted echo of Bushido, stripped of its original context and nuance, turned into an ideology that sanctioned cruelty and demanded self-destruction. Films by directors like Kurosawa Akira presented complex portraits of samurai as flawed human beings navigating the tensions between honor and survival, duty and self-interest. The martial arts that samurai had practiced, kendo and judo and aikido and others spread around the world, valued not for their utility in combat, but as means of personal development, ways of cultivating discipline and presence. But in the decades of peace and prosperity that followed, the samurai were gradually rehabilitated, not as models for military valor, but as symbols of discipline, aesthetic refinement, and cultural identity. In modern Japan, the samurai exist in a realm between history and mythology. Their castles, the surviving ones carefully restored, are tourist attractions where visitors can imagine what it was like to be a warrior in an age of war. Their armor and swords are displayed in museums, beautiful and frightening artifacts from a vanished world. Samurai swords, once weapons, became treasured as art objects, their blades displaying a beauty that takes years of study to fully appreciate. The grain of the steel like clouds or waves, each sword unique, each a collaboration between human skill and the mysterious properties of fire and metal. The values associated with samurai, discipline, loyalty, attention to detail, perseverance, continue to be held up as ideals in Japanese culture, even in a society that is democratic, industrial, and thoroughly modern. The salaryman working endless hours for his company is sometimes described as embodying samurai loyalty. Their stories are told and retold in films, television dramas, novels, manga, and anime, endlessly recycled and reimagined, each generation finding new meanings in the old tales. What do we make of the samurai now, at the end of our long journey through their history? They were human beings with all the contradictions and complexities that entails. They could be selfless and loyal, but also ruthlessly ambitious and self-serving. They could create sublime beauty and commit horrific violence. They espoused honor, but frequently betrayed it when pragmatism demanded. The craftsman who spends decades perfecting a single skill is compared to the swordsman who trained until the blade became an extension of his body. The aesthetic of simplicity and restraint in design, architecture, and daily life traces its lineage back to the tea ceremony and the Zen-influenced culture of the samurai. The samurai emerged from a specific historical context, the chaos of early medieval Japan, and they evolved over centuries in response to changing circumstances. They transformed from rough, provincial warriors to rulers of the nation to scholars and administrators. And when the world they had created became obsolete, they faded away. Perhaps what makes the samurai so fascinating, so endlessly compelling, is that they represent a particular answer to universal questions. How should one live? What gives life meaning? How does one face death? They answered, through loyalty, through discipline, through the perfection of one's craft, through accepting mortality and living fully in each moment, because each moment may be the last. These answers were shaped by their specific time and culture, but they speak to something that transcends that context. We live in a world without feudal lords or hereditary warrior castes, a world where wars are fought with technologies they could not have imagined, and where the sword is an anachronism, a museum piece, a symbol without practical application. The ideal samurai of literature and legend, perfectly noble and utterly without fear, is a fiction. But it is a fiction that reflects something real, an aspiration toward excellence, toward living according to principles that give meaning to existence. But they left behind cultural forms and values that persist, that still resonate even in a world utterly different from theirs. Consider again that samurai kneeling in meditation in his simple room, the sound of rain on the tiled roof, a single candle guttering, casting shadows that shift and dance. He knows that death may come tomorrow, that his Lord may call upon him to sacrifice everything, that the beauty he perceives in the rain, in the sound of water on stone, in the smell of wet earth, is inseparable from its transience. He accepts this. We may not face what he faced, but we too live in uncertainty, in a world where permanence is illusion and loss is inevitable. Yet we still grapple with the same fundamental questions about meaning and mortality, about how to live with integrity in an uncertain world. And in that acceptance, he finds not despair, but a kind of freedom, a clarity that allows him to act with complete commitment, to appreciate the moment with total presence, to live without being paralyzed by fear of what is to come. The mist is rising again, as it did at the beginning of our journey, climbing the valley walls, wrapping itself around the ancient trees. The temple bell rings, marking the passage of time that flows like water, carrying all things toward the ocean. The samurai, those legendary warriors, are gone. The world they created has vanished. Perhaps there is something to learn from his example, not the specifics of his code or his culture, which belonged to another time, but the underlying attitude, the willingness to embrace discipline, to find meaning and service to something larger than oneself, to seek perfection knowing it cannot be achieved, to face the void without flinching. The path through the garden is swept clean, the stones worn smooth by countless footsteps. The maple trees spread their branches over still water that mirrors the sky, and a leaf falls, creating ripples that expand outward in perfect circles, each circle contained within the one before, reaching toward the edges and then fading into stillness. But their stories remain, passed down through generations, shaped and reshaped by each teller, yet carrying still some echo of what they were, what they aspired to be. In telling these stories, we connect with them across the centuries, and perhaps in listening, we find something of ourselves reflected back. Sleep comes softly now, like snow falling on a winter evening, quiet and gentle, covering everything in peaceful silence. The day's struggles fade, become distant and unimportant, like voices heard from far away. There's only this moment, this breath, this heartbeat slowing as the mind releases its grip on the world. Somewhere a flute plays a melody so old that no one remembers who composed it, only that it has always been beautiful, always been tinged with the awareness of beauty's fragility, the bittersweet knowledge that the moment between arrival and departure is all we ever have. In dreams, perhaps you walk those ancient paths we have traveled together, past rice paddies reflecting the sky, past mountain temples where incense smoke drifts upward, through castle gates where the guards stand silent, down to the shore where waves arrive and depart in eternal rhythm, each wave born from the deep ocean and returning to it, each wave unique and yet part of the vast whole. The figures you glimpse in the distance, walking ahead of you on the path, are they warriors preparing for battle, or farmers tending their fields, or monks in contemplation? It doesn't matter now. The samurai understood this transition, practiced it in their meditation and their martial arts, the letting go that is also a kind of readiness, the emptiness that contains all potential, the stillness at the center of motion. The story has been told, the long story of the samurai, and it is ending now as all stories must. The lessons have been offered without insistence, like gifts that may be accepted or left behind as one wishes. History is not just facts and dates, though it includes them. They are all part of the great flow. As we are part of it, as everything is part of it, the endless movement from what was to what will be, the present moment, the only point of contact between past and future, the only place we can ever truly stand. But these thoughts too are fading now, becoming soft and indistinct, like the memory of a memory, like the last light fading from the western sky after the sun has set. The mind drifts untethered, floating on dark water under stars that burn cold and distant. There is no urgency here, no need to grasp or understand. It is the accumulated experience of countless lives, the record of how human beings have tried to make sense of existence, to create order and beauty and meaning in a world that promises none of these things. The samurai were part of this great human project, as we are part of it, links in a chain that stretches back into unimaginable antiquity and forward into an unknowable future. The last candle gutters and goes out. The darkness is complete, but it is not empty darkness. It is filled with presence, with peace, the deep peace that comes when striving ceases, when the endless questions are set aside, when one simply is, without needing to be anything in particular, without needing to do or understand or control. There's only the gentle descent into rest, the body's wisdom taking over as consciousness recedes like the tide going out, exposing the sand, smooth and unmarked, waiting for morning. Let yourself drift now, held safely in the current, carried gently through the darkness toward whatever morning comes. The stories have been told. The warriors have laid down their swords and bows. The battles are finished, the victories and defeats equally meaningless now, equally distant. The samurai knew this darkness in the moments between waking and sleeping, between meditation and action, between life and death. The space where all distinctions dissolve, where warrior and farmer, master and servant, past and present, self and other, all merge into the singular flow of being that has no name and needs none. In the garden, cherry blossoms fall in the darkness, unseen but no less beautiful for being unwitnessed. The stream flows over smooth stones with a sound like whispered sutras, the water knowing nothing but its own movement, seeking always the lowest place, finding its way around every obstacle with effortless grace. Only the peace remains, vast and encompassing, the peace that was there before the first sword was forged and will be there after the last one has rusted away. The peace that is always here, always now, waiting beneath the noise and struggle, patient as stone, gentle as falling snow. Somewhere in a simple wooden hall that exists now only in memory and imagination, a warrior kneels in perfect stillness, and that stillness extends outward like ripples in water, embracing the whole world, the whole of time, until there is no inside or outside, no then or now, no here or there, only the eternal present moment that contains everything and asks nothing. Rest now. The journey is complete. You have traveled far, through centuries and across battlefields, through palaces and mountain temples, through stories of courage and betrayal, loyalty and ambition, beauty and violence. The wind moves through pine branches with a sound that might be breath, might be the earth itself breathing, in and out, the great slow respiration of mountains and forests in the turning seasons. Gives everything and takes nothing, simply is and has always been and will always be, unchanging beneath all changes, the still point around which the world turns. You have walked with warriors long dead, witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the forging of swords and the writing of poems, the moment when cherry blossoms fall and the moment when the blade is drawn. All of this you have seen, and now it is time to let it go, to release it like breath exhaled, like a hand unclenching, like a mind that stops grasping and simply opens. The gate stands open. Beyond it, only peace, only silence, only the vast and gentle darkness that holds all things in its embrace. The darkness that is not absence but presence, not void but fullness. The darkness from which all things come and to which all things return. The darkness that knows your name though you have forgotten it. The darkness that welcomes you now without judgment or expectation. The way of the warrior leads here, as all ways do, to the place before birth and after death, the place that is nowhere and everywhere, the place you have never left and are always seeking, home in the truest sense, the home that requires no building and cannot be destroyed, that exists in stillness and silence, in the space between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, asking only that you stop, that you rest, that you let go of everything you are carrying and simply be here, now, in this moment that is all moments, this place that is all places. Sleep. Sleep deeply and peacefully. Sleep with the sleep of warriors who have fought their battles and laid down their swords. Sleep with the sleep of travelers who have reached their destination. Sleep with the sleep of children who know they are safe. Sleep with the sleep of the earth itself, deep and dreamless, the great rest from which all life springs and to which all life returns. The story is ending. The voice is fading. The words are becoming spaces between words, and the spaces are becoming everything, expanding like darkness, like silence, like the moment just before dawn when